This presentation, Perspectives on Trauma and Resilience, will provide information for educators and other school staff. The objectives of this presentation are to learn the developmental and brain-based effects of trauma and toxic stress, and how resiliency can mitigate these negative effects in children and adolescents. Objectives also include an increased understanding of the important role of educators in enhancing the resiliency of their students and some strategies to do so. This is our agenda today. Maslow's theory of the hierarchy of needs states that children can't learn if their basic needs are not being met and they don't feel safe. The information provided today is intended to increase an understanding of the trauma and stress reactions that many of our students experience. Trauma impacts basic physiological functioning and the ability to feel safe. To reach full potential, including full academic potential, a student needs to feel safe. Trauma results from an event, series of events, or set of circumstances experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening, with lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. The experience can be real or perceived. Trauma can interfere with a child's development in many ways and alter his or her sense of self. 1 out of 4 students have experienced a traumatic event. 11% of all girls ages 14 to 17 have experienced sexual assault. 60% of students 17 years or younger have been exposed to crime, violence, and/or abuse. We often don't know a child or adolescent's history of trauma.
Children's experience of trauma is shaped by their individual physiological, cognitive, and psychological differences, as well as their prior life experience. One child may be more traumatized by the same event than another. The more resilient children and adolescents are, the more likely they are to be able to withstand significant life stressors, including traumatic situations. Later, we will present information on resiliency and how resiliency can be fostered in students.
Various traumatic events can significantly affect a child. The most damaging traumatic event is that which involves the parent as the abuser. Medical trauma relates to that experienced during invasive medical procedures, which might involve separation from a parent. Traumatic grief can occur after a death that is sudden and unexpected, for example, through violence, accident, or illness. Some families with refugee status have been moving into school districts across the state. Children in these families may have experienced a range of traumatizing experiences. There are different ways someone can be exposed to trauma: as a victim, as a witness of traumatic event or circumstance, being related to or connected to someone who has endured or been part of a highly negative experience, or exposure to trauma by hearing details, media exposure, by playing graphic, violent video games, and so forth.
Complex trauma. This describes both children's exposure to multiple traumatic events, often an invasive interpersonal nature, and a wide-ranging long-term effects of this trauma exposure. Complex trauma creates significant stress and affects the ability to think, learn, and relate to others. When we talk about trauma, we need to talk about stress because they are highly related, and know that not all stress is bad stress.
There are different types of stress. Positive stress response is a normal and essential part of healthy development. It involves brief physical reactions. Tolerable stress response activates the body's alert systems to a greater degree. The effects are time-limited and buffered by relationships with adults who help the child adapt to the effects of the stressor. Toxic stress response occurs when a situation is experienced as traumatic, and particularly when there is no adult to support. Toxic stress weakens the architecture of the developing brain, which can lead to lifelong problems with learning, behavior, and physical and mental health. Toxic stress is the result of traumatic experiences. Children who suffer from toxic stress have been exposed to one or more adverse situations and develop reactions that persist and affect their daily lives, even after the events have ended. Toxic stress response can occur when a child experiences strong, frequent, and/or prolonged adverse situations. Traumatic reactions can include a variety of responses, such as intense and ongoing emotional upset, depression, anxiety, attention and academic difficulties, problems managing feelings, difficulties relating to others or forming attachments, sleep and eating disturbances, and physical symptoms. Adolescents may use alcohol or other drugs, behave in risky ways, or engage in unhealthy sexual activity. Many children and adolescents experience toxic stress resulting from traumatic or other stressful circumstances. Because of that, it is important to adopt a trauma-informed lens with all our students. It's a lens that is needed to be used all the time to ensure an experience of emotional safety in the classroom, in the cafeteria, in the office, in the gym. Promoting trauma-sensitive school approaches has the greatest potential to positively impact all students, regardless of trauma history. Think back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Students struggle to learn when they don't feel safe. Adverse childhood experiences can create physical and emotional unsafety and have long-lasting negative impacts. The ACE study is one of the largest investigations ever conducted to determine the connection between adverse, highly negative, childhood experiences, called ACEs, and later life mental and physical health.
What does your parents' divorce have to do with your risk for heart disease? If your mother had a drinking problem when you were growing up, are you more likely to suffer from depression as an adult? Here's what you should know about ACEs. ACEs stand for Adverse Childhood Experiences, extremely stressful events that can happen to a child growing up. Some experiences are so stressful that they can alter brain development, as well as the immune system, increasing the risk of lifelong health and social problems in adulthood. The term comes from the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, landmark research that shed new light on the root cause of everything from stroke and liver disease to substance abuse and mental illness. In the late 1990s, an epidemiologist from the Centers for Disease Control, and a preventive medicine doctor at Kaiser Permanente, set out to understand the association between childhood experience and lifelong health. They asked over 17,000 people in the Kaiser Health Plan in San Diego about their health history, as well as difficult questions about their experiences growing up. Anda and Felitti tallied up 10 different kinds of adversity in this largely middle-class and college-educated population. They were stunned to see how common ACEs were. 21% of all respondents were sexually abused as children. 19% grew up with someone who suffered mental illness. 28% had been physically abused. And 2 out of 3 respondents had experienced at least one ACE. The researchers next looked at how someone's ACE score, or the number of adversities they experienced, related to a wide array of serious health and social problems. They saw that the more ACEs someone had, the greater their risk for poor outcomes compared with someone with no ACEs. Someone with an ACE score of 4 had twice the risk of heart disease and cancer. Someone with an ACE score of 5 had an 8 times greater chance of being an alcoholic. And those with an ACE score of 6 or more, on average, died 20 years earlier. With every major problem they looked at in the ACE study, the risk went up for each additional adverse experience in childhood. As Dr. Robert Anda says, what's predictable is preventable. It's important to remember that ACEs are not destiny. ACEs are a tool for understanding the health of a population as a whole. For individuals, an ACE score can be a tool for understanding their own risk for health and social problems, and empower them to make changes for themselves and their children. ACEs tend to get passed down from generation to generation and are common across all income levels, races, and cultures. But increasingly, people of all different professions and backgrounds are coming together to discuss how ACEs affect their communities. They're finding new ways to treat and prevent ACEs. Many doctors are starting to screen their patients for ACEs as part of their medical history. More schools are becoming trauma-informed, considering the source of problem behavior when disciplining their students, instead of immediately suspending or expelling them. To learn more about interrupting the cycle of adversity and improving health and well-being for the next generation, please visit kpjrfilms.co.
Adverse experiences during childhood are very common. Adverse childhood experiences, ACEs, can disrupt neurological growth and impair social, emotional, and cognitive development. ACEs can also lead to high-risk behaviors, including alcohol and other drug use, and are associated with major chronic health, mental health, economic, and social issues throughout life. Multiple ACEs, 6 or more in the ACE study, are very likely to lead to death 20 years earlier than expected. Adverse childhood experiences and chronic stress can impact a child or adolescent's developing brain and the ability to learn. Experience becomes biology. Adverse childhood experiences have dramatic effects on the developing brains of children and adolescents.
Given increased sophistication in brain imaging, we know that the human brain continues to develop into the mid-20s. The human brain develops from the back to the front, from the amygdala, the seat of emotions, and the hippocampus to the prefrontal cortex, the decision-making part of the brain. This slide shows changes over time in the natural pathways of the developing brain. The brains of children are particularly plastic and subject to damage because of trauma and toxic stress.
Learning to deal with stress is an important part of healthy development. When experiencing stress, the stress response system is activated. The body and brain go on alert. There's an adrenaline rush, increased heart rate, and an increase in stress hormone levels. When the stress is relieved after a short time, or a young child receives support from caring adults, the stress response winds down and the body quickly returns to normal. In severe situations, such as ongoing abuse and neglect, where there is no caring adult to act as a buffer against the stress response stays activated. Even when there is no apparent physical harm, the extended absence of response from adults can activate the stress response system. Constant activation of the stress response overloads developing systems, with serious, lifelong consequences for the child. This is known as toxic stress. Over time, this results in a stress response system set permanently on high alert. In the areas of the brain dedicated to learning and reasoning, the neural connections that comprise brain architecture are weaker and fewer in number. Science shows that the prolonged activation of stress hormones in early childhood can actually reduce neural connections in these important areas of the brain at just the time when they should be growing new ones. Toxic stress can be avoided if we ensure that the environments in which children grow and develop are nurturing, stable, and engaging.
Besides changing neural connections in the brain, the stress of trauma can affect the chemistry and the size of the brain. Traumatic stress also alters the functioning of the immune system. The earlier in life a trauma occurs, the more damage is likely. There is good news. Increasing research has found that this damage to the brain is reversible, and that with the help and support of caring adults, the brains of children and adolescents affected by trauma can actually change.
Imaging studies show that trauma impacts the brain's limbic system, which includes the amygdala and the hippocampus. The amygdala is involved with emotional responses and reaction to stimuli. The amygdala of traumatized individuals is often overly sensitive, resulting in extreme alertness. Trauma also affects the hippocampus, which is involved with memory. When the limbic system is activated, for example, when someone detects a perceived threat, it shuts down the prefrontal cortex in the brain, which is responsible for thinking logically, planning, organizing, and remembering, all the essentials for learning. When a child or adolescent is traumatized or toxically stressed, the prefrontal cortex isn't available for thinking or learning. You have a student who is only using his limbic system. No learning will occur until you help him calm and feel safe.
Traumatic stress can result in physiological reactions that create persistent patterns of behavior. Fight, flight, or freeze. Someone can alternate between these patterns. The fight, flight, freeze response results from the activation of the body's autonomic system designed to protect us from perceived emotional or physical threat or danger.
You know what anxiety feels like. We all do. Everyone experiences anxiety in some way or another. It's something that connects all of us together. Why we feel anxiety and what it really is, that may surprise you. Without anxiety, we'd all be in serious trouble. As soon as your brain senses you're in danger, a little piece of it, called the amygdala, kicks in. It gets your body ready to react. That could mean fight, run away, or shut down. It's called the fight, flight, or freeze response. This reaction goes back millions of years to our distant animal ancestors. Animals whose amygdalae were more sensitive to danger were more likely to stay alive and off the menu. Over millions of generations, this developed into the system we all know as anxiety. So you see, anxiety itself is not all bad. But when there's no immediate life or death threat, and your amygdala keeps telling your body that you're in danger, that's when anxiety becomes a problem. Your amygdala doesn't know the difference between getting eaten and public speaking or failing a test. Human society has only existed for a relatively short time. It's messy and complicated and confusing, and our amygdalae just haven't had time to catch up. So sometimes, when we're in uncomfortable situations, our brains misread the risk and overreact. Our hearts beat faster and we breathe heavily, pulling more oxygen into our bodies. The muscles in our arms and legs tense up and fill with blood. Our skin perspires to cool us down. This would all be great if we needed to fight or run, but instead, we just feel tense and sweaty. Sometimes our minds go blank and we feel like we can't move or talk. That would be great if we needed to hide. Instead, we just feel stuck. When things trigger our anxiety, sometimes we try to avoid them, like our ancestors avoiding a predator. But that can cause problems when those triggers are important parts of life, like going to school or meeting new people, things that won't just give up and go away. So how does knowing all this help? Well, it starts with remembering what's really going on. There's nothing physically wrong with you. It's just your amygdala trying to tell you it thinks you're in danger, even if it gets confused about how much danger you're really in. Understanding why we feel anxiety is an important step in learning to manage it.
The fight response involves hyperalertness to perceived danger and quick movement to agitation or anger, often resulting in problems controlling emotions. The ability to maintain attention and to learn is compromised. The flight response involves flight physically or mentally from the external environment. Flight response behaviors can include daydreaming or fantasizing. The ability to maintain attention and to learn is compromised. The freeze response is an acute stress response that can involve the numbing of emotions or the absence of experienced feelings. The ability to think may be frozen or immobilized for a time. The freeze response may include disassociation. That is a lack of connection to a person's thoughts, memory, and sense of identity. It is not always evident when a child or adolescent is disassociating. At times, it may appear as if they are simply spacing out or not paying attention. Like the fight and flight response, the freeze response impairs a student's ability to concentrate and learn. As Maslow's hierarchy of needs indicates, to reach full potential, including full academic potential, a student needs to feel safe. Trauma impacts basic physiological functioning and the ability to feel safe. A child who has experienced trauma can look unmotivated academically and can be low achieving in school. We discuss the effects of trauma on a student's performance. Childhood trauma is highly connected with poor school achievement, lower standardized test scores, and retention. Students can become disengaged from school and drop out. There is significant overrepresentation of students that have experienced trauma in special education. Trauma researcher Dr. Bessel van der Kolk states that attention, attachment, and emotional control are the main areas of difficulty for children and adolescents that have experienced trauma.
ADD, emotional problems, trouble making friends. Are people who have experienced childhood trauma more likely to exhibit these behaviors? When trauma occurs at an early age, it affects development in many ways. This can cause reactions in children that aren't even seen in adults with PTSD. Dr. Bessel van der Kolk explains how childhood trauma contributes to these problems.
We're really beginning to develop a discipline of childhood trauma. And what we see when we look at those kids is that, and these kids as they grow older, that their problems are very different from PTSD. Their problems are primarily has to do with attention, being able to focus in on something and to engage with something in a very steady, consistent way. So they get thrown off, they have a hard time really focusing on things, sticking with things, concentrating on things, filtering irrelevant stuff out, so they get hijacked. So that's one very big issue, which deserves its own whole special series of treatment. The second thing is the core issue of affect regulation. And that is that we have our emotions in order to tell us what to do and where to go, to orient our bodies, our minds to the reality around us. Traumatized people's emotions become too large, too extreme, or they become too quiet, and once they get activated, unlike people who are relatively doing pretty well, and you get upset, and 10 minutes later you're fine again, you go back to work. And so chronically traumatized people keep getting stuck. Something happened yesterday, and today they're still out of sorts about it, and tomorrow they're still out of sorts about it, and their whole weekend is hijacked by something that's happened, and then they deal with that hijacking by trying to calm themselves down in any way they can. And that's where the whole issue of drugs and alcohol comes in, and self-mutilation and eating disorders, because they all seem to be chronic adaptations to this affect dysregulation problem that you see in this population. The third area is in the area of relationships. So if somebody has messed with you, you have a basic perception of the world that people will hurt you, will make you not feel safe, that you're helpless, that people are going to mess with you. So you position yourself in the world as somebody who should always protect herself, or as somebody who should be aggressive or arrogant or distant or dependent and compliant and please everybody, because if you stand up for yourself, terrible things will happen to yourself. And so there's the main sort of three different areas. So it's not about memory, but it's the formation of the self, the brain, the mind, and bodily.
Trauma response can look similar to symptoms of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Children and adolescents that have experienced trauma can be inattentive, hyperactive, and impulsive, and can be misdiagnosed as having ADHD. Maintaining classroom structure and predictable routine, allowing extra test time, and a quiet place for test taking are strategies that can promote the ability to concentrate and perform academically. Trauma can shape a child's entire view of the world. It can significantly affect children's capacity to trust and feel safe, as well as their ability to relate to others with social competence. Students learn best in classroom environments that are warm and where they feel connected and safe. Students function best when positive interactions are modeled, their feelings are validated, and their growth is acknowledged.
Triggers associated with trauma can activate the brain's limbic system, resulting in problems controlling feelings and behaviors.
So what can you do to help when an adolescent or child is emotionally dysregulated? Well, I can tell you, you do not need to be a mental health specialist to assist students in developing emotional control. To effectively deal with an emotionally dysregulated child or adolescent, we need to be calm. First thing to do would be to take a deep breath and remind ourselves not to take it personally, no matter how provoking a student's behavior may be. On the screen, you'll see there are strategies that can assist in helping students that struggle with emotional control.
The brain of a child and adolescent is plastic, as it is in the process of development. Developing brains can actually undergo positive changes under favorable circumstances. We can be part of supporting positive brain changes in our students by how we relate to them. This can be best understood within the context of resilience. Resilience can mitigate the effects of trauma. Schools can play a key role in addressing the needs of traumatized children by fostering the characteristics of resilience. Research suggests that the negative effects of adverse child experiences can be significantly reduced or even eliminated by nurturing connections in school. Resilience refers to positive adaptation to life despite experiencing adversity. Resilience is the capacity to bounce back after difficult circumstances. If we invest in good relationships with our students, they will be more likely to feel safe and better able to learn.
Resilience is not some magical quality. It's something that really can be built, even in difficult circumstances.
The key active core ingredient to building resilience are the relationships kids have to others who care about them.
Of course, families play a very important role, but nobody raises children in isolation. We have a huge amount of research to show the powerful impacts of teachers, coaches, other adults in the community with whom children have a chance to develop relationships, who play that critical supportive role of building resilience. As a result of responsive interaction, children build simple skills of coping and adapting. How to stop crying, how to regulate your behavior, being able to defer gratification.
You have an adaptive toolkit that allows you at moments of stress or challenge to bring out a number of potential skills that allow you to get through
it. As children get older, the sophistication of those skills increases. Being able to monitor situations, solve problems. The way we as a society can nurture the development of resilience is to help communities to pay more attention to building the capabilities of the adults who care for children and provide the supports they need to tip the scales toward more positive life outcomes.
And then when communities say, we want to be an active part of crafting the solution, to really understand what's necessary to produce the resilience, that's when the ball gets rolling.
Resilience building, capacity building, is really in everyone's interest, and everyone reaps the benefits when we do that well.
Research shows that if they have an attachment to trusted adults, children and adolescents can be very resilient, even if they have experienced adverse childhood experiences.
Brene Brown is a researcher that studies connection and vulnerability. She wrote a book called Daring Greatly, and her work supports the fact that the single strongest protective factor for youth is having at least one close relationship with an adult. Because children spend considerable time in school, know that that adult can and often is you. Where can teachers turn for help? Consult with your school counselor, school social worker, or school psychologist about any concerns you have about a student.
These are some resources for information on childhood trauma. Additional information on building resiliency in our students will be provided over time. Feel free to contact us.